Happy Friday, everybody. Sam Shapiro back here with more of your Heat latest on FanArc. Don't forget to drop a like on this video and, of course, subscribe for great daily content pertaining to the Miami Heat Monday through Friday, all right here. Jimmy Butler is a liar. That's what new reports from Barry Jackson of the Miami Herald is suggesting right now, as kind of explaining over the week how Jimmy Butler's agent, Bernie Lee, promised the Miami Heat that Butler would comport himself well last season and would never complain about not getting a contract statement, at least going into the regular season this past year. But unfortunately, that was not really what we saw over the course of, how this season transpired. Progressively, the beef between Butler and Riley getting worse and worse as the season progressed, eventually leading to the point where he was taken out of the starting lineup, and by February, he was off to the Bay playing with the likes of Stephen Curry. And it's really just unfortunate to see that this report that this report really has been made public, just because it kind of explained how this really gave Miami no room for negotiation. Really, it kind of just makes Jimmy Butler seem like a villain, really, and him declaring that I must leave right now and there's nothing you can do about it, because quite honestly, you're not necessarily thinking about what you can hopefully get in terms of high value. And in the grand scheme of things, Miami could have definitely gotten a lot more than what they did in that Jimmy Butler trade, considering how he got Miami to 2 finals appearances during his time there, despite not winning either contest. The fact that Miami was in that position 2 times with him. I remember when he eventually signed with Miami just a few seasons ago, analysts were joking that he was going to go and take a vacation there for the second portion of his career and really not bolster his game a whole lot and be kind of a leader that, a supporting star like he was on Philly or Minnesota, and was going to kind of, digress a little bit in his game. But it really elevated his game and almost kind of put him into the conversation of being a potential superstar, especially in a postseason scenario. So kind of just unfortunate to see this report suggesting that Butler ultimately lied to Miami, and his agent kind of saying that, he wasn't going to complain about not making extra money, and he wasn't really going to get upset that he felt Miami was not really valuing him. I think also a lot of the anger stemmed from Miami's lack of really getting another superstar to pair up with him. The whole Damian Lillard thing not really working out. Lillard obviously going to Milwaukee and still not being able to get anything done with arguably one of the best defensive players in the league at the time in Antetokounmpo. But it's just unfortunate to see that was kind of, or there are now reports of that claiming that was a big reason why Butler and Riley kind of had a falling out in the first place. Drop in the comments if you think, what you really think of this entire scenario, because to me it's kind of unfortunate. I'm hoping that, the whole truth wasn't really uncovered, and, that it was kind of a mutual, both parties were kind of wrong in this, because it kind of just paints Jimmy Butler to have a sour taste in his mouth, and him having a bigger ego than, quite honestly, he's very confident in his game, and he was a very solid player, and I think he's very true to himself in terms of what he believes he can do on the court. But kind of just unfortunate to see that this report is suggesting this was kind of the beginning of the end, so to speak, in the grand scheme of things. Now, moving over to another topic we have kind of been touching on over the last couple of weeks, Russell Westbrook, still a free agent, and I know I've kind of talked on the channel about how Miami should consider looking at him if they're trying to add guards, especially to their backcourt. Almost more in a sense, they're prioritizing that ahead of wanting to add a big man to a roster that really kind of needs the help at that, in the 3 through 5 positions specifically. But then recently, signing Dru Smith over the past week kind of bolstered the question, what are Miami's real priorities they're looking for in some of these guards they're signing? And it just raised the question for me, Dru Smith versus Russell Westbrook, why, how did Miami kind of come to this conclusion? It also brings up kind of an interesting debate. You have a young guard in Dru Smith who's overcome a handful of injuries over the last couple of seasons, who clearly shows grit on the court, and quite honestly, defensively is a very good add in terms of adding value defensively to Miami's backcourt. Now, on the other hand, you have a former MVP in the league who has definitely seen his better days of basketball ahead of him already and is now starting to kind of digress in terms of what he can add on the court. But people forget Westbrook in his prime, when he was a lot younger, before he was MVP Russ, also had to suffer a lot of injuries like that. Suffered an ACL tear as well, and just quite honestly, I just think that it ultimately made him stronger and more durable going into his prime years, especially with OKC. And so it's interesting. Like, I wonder if Miami maybe takes that in consideration, like overcoming injuries like that in terms of what his value, like his game, and how that's kind of centered around what value that would add to Miami's team, and then their priority in terms of trying to make their core a lot younger, which I'm going to touch on a little bit more later in this episode. But it kind of raised the question to me, what is Miami trying to prioritize and hopefully trying to build a young core? And does that necessarily mean the younger guy is more valuable than the veteran type of player that clearly, can make a difference whatever bench he's coming off of, whether it's in Denver or Houston or, in this case, it would have been Miami. So drop in the comments if you think Dru Smith versus Russell Westbrook, who would be the better ad for Miami. It's clear who they've picked at this point, if they're going to take one guard over the other, that being Dru Smith at this point in time. But I just thought it was an interesting conversation to debate, a young defensive guard versus a old veteran guard who former MVP. Both could definitely add value to this team's backcourt in the grand scheme of things, but I'm curious if they went with the young defensive guard because the ceiling for potential, because he's younger right now, definitely shows a little bit more promise and more potential to eventually become a strong player like Russ once was. I'm not saying Dru Smith's going to ever be a league MVP or, is going to even play in the same conversation as Russell Westbrook had, but because he's younger, I feel like Miami maybe had kind of placed more value because he has definitely more time to grow into a better player than he is right now. And if both players can kind of both offer Miami this, the same thing right now, and one player potentially has more to offer going down the line, then maybe that was why they, didn't really look at it as a Dru Smith versus Russell Westbrook kind of sign. So drop in the comments what you think Miami's thought process was there and who would definitely be a better option in terms of adding to Milwaukee's backcourt. And now kind of transitioning to another subject that I think has kind of been the forefront in this free agency, really summer for Miami, is adding some big men to Miami's front court. And I know I kind of touched on the topic of Nikola Vucevic being added to Miami, and just a lot of different. I definitely talked about one trade proposal involving him, and I definitely thought that some players were going to be needed to, I guess, be added in that. But now Sports Illustrated is saying that, Miami could really probably get him for a solid first-round draft pick either next year or from the year after. And I think that necessarily to Chicago wouldn't be the worst trade in the world, just because Chicago, not really a strong team right now, definitely kind of in rebuilding mode, and, building up some draft capital for a veteran guy that's clearly not helping them stay on the over 500 kind of trend could really benefit Miami, who's kind of looking at a win now type of mentality, even though being on the backseat of the Eastern Conference in terms of playoff teams. I think this trade kind of really would help both teams, because the Bulls getting more assets to help rebuild in an era where they're really trying to get their ducks in a row, and Vucevic adding size and physicality in terms of a veteran player to their front court especially. So I think Vucevic would be a very, very good add for Miami, especially if you're only going to have to give up draft capital, especially for a talented veteran big, honestly, that I think would really, really bolster bench depth. You have Kel'el Ware and Bam starting, and then you have a guy like Vucevic, and then maybe Vlad Golden also coming out of there. I mean, that's a pretty solid 4-5 core you have, a solid core of power forwards and centers you kind of have for Miami going into that season. So drop in the comments if you'd like to see a trade like that happen. I think it would definitely benefit Chicago more than meets the eye. But, some people might argue that giving up draft capital like that wouldn't necessarily be the best thing in the world either. And in the grand scheme of things, I can't see Miami wanting to give up any first-round draft assets, especially for a veteran player who potentially could be washed in a couple of years just because of, being on the older side, maybe seeing some of their better days and seasons prior. But Miami kind of needs this depth, especially in their front court right now. And Chicago, looking to rebuild, definitely could probably get some decent assets out of that in the grand scheme of things. So drop in the comments if you think that would be a pretty solid add for Miami overall. And I just think it would definitely be a beneficial for both teams going forward. And lastly, another thing I wanted to touch on, Miami really trying to spend the course of this offseason building a young core, especially with their guards. But the question I have is, can a young core really lead Miami to success? Maybe in a couple years when that core gets a little bit older, I definitely think. But right now, obviously, when you see Spoelstra going to watch, some of these players play overseas, it shows promise that they're invested in these guys and really developing them for the long haul. So, then when they kind of reach 27, 28, which is probably around the peak of when they're going to be in their athletic prime anyway, it's nice to see that they're truly invested in not just the success of their team, but the development of the players they have on their team. And the question begs, if you're signing these young guys, are you expecting to be successful right now? And right now, the Heat's projected 9-man rotation is one of the youngest they've had in years, averaging at about just under 26 years old. And then, veterans like Kevin Love and Jimmy Butler being gone, that also just kind of makes the team even younger in that regard. But this kind of begs the question, especially letting guys like Palo Larson and Nikola Jovic kind of develop over the course of this summer, is the young core Miami have, this is kind of a heat check. Is the young core ready to cook? And I think especially with kind of the international play over this summer, there are definitely some stats that are leading to that right now. It's also interesting thinking that Wiggins is one of the oldest players on this roster. He's the second oldest player on the team at 30 years old, which is kind of unbelievable. But when you look at some trends in the league with other teams, you look at the Oklahoma City Thunder especially, back in 2023-24, when their average median age was roughly 25 years old, they surged to a top 4 seed behind Shea when they still had Josh Giddey and then Chet, and now obviously kind of letting that team marinate over the last year or two. They were an unstoppable force in the Western Conference this year, which is, in the grand scheme of things, a pretty hard conference to dominate, especially over the course of the regular season, and then to come out and win the title, especially, having that young core established really kind of set the groundwork for them. And then when you look at the 22-23 Grizzlies, that team's average age was also sitting around 25 years old. They led the league in fast break points and defensive ratings. And, people say, oh, defense wins championships, yada, yada, yada. But, the Grizzlies ended up being a pretty formidable team for a couple seasons after that as well, and being a scary threat in the West, kind of following that season as they developed some of the guys on that roster. And then when you compare it to older teams like the 2021-22 Lakers, who their average age of 30, they eventually missed the playoffs despite having Anthony Davis, Russell Westbrook, and LeBron James all on that team. So I'm not saying that having an older team necessarily means you're going to be worse, but there are definitely some trends from teams that we've seen in previous years that suggest that building a young core and kind of letting them marinate for a year or two could definitely help bolster a team to the next level. And I think, Miami giving a chance to, some of these guys that I had just mentioned, especially in this block, especially develop over the next summer, and then acquiring those guys now, it's going to be an interesting heat check. I'm not saying that they're going to come out this season and be absolutely ready to cook, but it's kind of on a trend hopefully it could happen any season now. And hopefully in a season or two, if Miami continues to bank on this young core and build it, that some of the guys that have been able to come in over the last season or two will be able to develop in leading that younger core and keeping, whether you're keeping the age at that range or not. I don't necessarily think if the team is always young and always developing that they are going to be successful, but if you kind of try to build the grand median of your team like that now, we could hopefully see in 26-27 Miami really, really make a good run at the NBA Finals, hopefully building around the young core they have right now. And I hope that's mainly why they're prioritizing building a plethora of young guys on their roster at this point in time. So drop in the comments what you think, what the thought process is right now, and if this young core could lead Miami to success now in a season or in maybe 2 or 3 seasons. But if they don't invest in these guys and they don't try to develop them, I don't think it's going to at least help them win in the course of the beginning of this regular season. But if it doesn't help them now, I think it's definitely going to help them later if they continue to bet on their young core. That's going to, or at least the young core that they have right now. But that's going to do it for today's episode of your Heat Latest. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, we've got great daily content all here pertaining to the Miami Heat. Happy Friday, everybody. I'm Sam Shapiro, and don't forget to have a great weekend.